Tonight, FBI investigators at Quantico could be on the verge, perhaps, of a critical breakthrough in the Nancy Guthrie case, potentially using a new and cutting-edge technology that has proven to extract DNA from even the most difficult and degraded evidence. Our Brian Enton has learned that strands of hair were found inside Nancy Guthrie's home during what we believe were the initial phases of the investigation, and that those strands of hair have now been sent to the FBI for, quote, advanced analysis 2 months after she went missing. Until now, the Pima County Sheriff's Office has been using a Florida lab to handle all of its DNA testing, a decision that was controversial from the start.
Want to get exactly what I got from my source right. Some DNA evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home has been sent to the FBI's lab for advanced analysis. I'm told that the evidence includes hairs found in Guthrie's home. And that's an interesting part of this because we haven't known in the past that some of the evidence that they are testing for DNA has been hairs.
FBI sources have long indicated frustration with their limited access to the DNA, and the sheriff's office has struggled with analyzing so-called mixed DNA found at the crime scene. Experts believe the hair that is finally being sent to the FBI lab is likely rootless, meaning there's very little, if any, actual human tissue on the strands. Previously, those hairs were useless in criminal investigations in cases like this. But now there's something called whole genome sequencing. It's a method that extracts nuclear DNA from just the shaft of a stray hair. You don't need the root on the end. To give you an idea of just how mind-blowing the technology is, it's the same kind of DNA testing that helped break the case of Rex Heuermann, the Gilgo Beach serial killer. Of course, we don't yet know whose hair this is and whether it belongs to the suspect, to Nancy herself, or to any other person who might have wandered through her home at any time. But it does seem like investigators at least have a hunch that this could lead to something big. Joining us now is renowned DNA expert and genetic genealogist Cece Moore, the nation's premier DNA expert, and former CIA officer and News Nation national security contributor Tracy Walter. Great to have both of you with us. Cece, this lab in Florida wasn't able to do anything with the hair, but now they've sent it to Quantico where they're able to do this sort of mixed DNA testing?
The hair is not the mixed DNA that we've been hearing about. Hair would be single source. The lab in Florida does have some capabilities, and if there had been a root, they would have already tested this and I'm sure been successful. It's a lot harder when you don't have the root, which is why we believe this is rootless hair or a hair shaft. The FBI themselves would not be the ones trying to extract DNA from that because they work with a company in Santa Cruz called Estrella Forensics. That's who has done all of the rootless hair work for the FBI, including in the Rex Heuermann Gilgo Beach murders.
So the hair actually won't be tested at Quantico. Quantico will then send it to this lab in Santa Cruz.
If it's rootless, absolutely. Yeah, they might be testing it in other ways, but to extract that DNA, that SNP profile that we need for genetic genealogy, they would be sending that to Estrella, I'm sure, because they've had such a track record with them and so much success in the past.
Tracy, why do you think they're focusing on these strands of hair, given, I mean, it could come from anywhere, anyone, at any time?
Well, you're right. I mean, I think, listen, any kind of forensic evidence that's at the scene can be attributed to anyone. It can be the suspect, it could be the victim, it could be so many different people. But the problem is we need this information to be able to rule people out or rule people in this case. And so in a case like this, where we really actually don't have a lot of digital forensic evidence, which obviously the FBI is very good at, really this becomes very, very important. We have a clear lack of video forensic evidence, as we have seen, as well as really phone and those kinds of forensic evidence. And so I think in this case, there's no question that hair is going to be important in terms of ruling whomever that is in or out. And the FBI is going to probably have to investigate if they can get a hit on it, who it is.
Cece, most hair found at crime scenes, is it rootless hair, just the shaft?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's really common to test the root from a hair with forensic evidence. But we are finding that there are thousands of cases that don't have any other type of DNA evidence. And that's why this is
You're
so
talking
groundbreaking.
no blood, no saliva,
Right.
no semen, nothing.
Right. And so that's why we've been suddenly able to solve cases that weren't even solvable prior to even with genetic genealogy. So genetic genealogy came in 2018. The ability that Dr. Ed Green created to extract this profile from rootless hair is even newer than that. So it's another leap forward that opens up a lot more cases to potentially be solved.
How long will it take the lab, Australia lab, to test this hair?
Well, in my experience, because I've worked with them a lot, it typically takes months. But I'm
Months.
guessing, because this is not a cold case, that they will likely push it up in priority and start working on it immediately. And then part of it is luck. Sometimes they can get DNA the first time around, and sometimes they have to go through several attempts before they can get that viable profile.
Tracy, you know, since you've been covering this case with us, there's been so much criticism of the Pima County Sheriff and the decisions that he and his team made on this case. A lot of that criticism was about the fact that they chose to use this lab in Florida, which I need to point out is quite reputable. A lot of law enforcement agencies use it and have great success with it. What's your assessment of that lab, and should the Pima County Sheriff have relied on that lab instead of Quantico from the start? Because that's a lot of people are criticizing him for making that choice.
Thank you for making that point about the lab. This is a lab that is actually certified by the FBI. This isn't some, random lab that they sent this sample to. So I just want to make that point clear. However, obviously I'm a former FBI agent. I try to go a little bit easier on anyone in law enforcement, but I actually vehemently disagree with what Sheriff Nanos did in this case. I think in a case of this nature, now listen, at Quantico, they can't just process all of the DNA evidence that comes in. This is why we have private labs, for speed and for efficiency. But in a case like this, where you may know that you may have some DNA samples, or excuse me, some biological samples that maybe didn't get DNA from, it should have immediately gone to the FBI. I think they lost 11 weeks of time.
Yeah, and now Cece's telling us it could conceivably be a few months before the lab in California actually gets results from this shaft of hair. Just remind us, Cece, how did they make the break in the Gilgo Beach serial killer using this exact same kind of testing?
Yeah, there were a number of hairs found on multiple victims in the burlap sacks, on the belts, and a couple other places. They were able to extract SNP profiles from those and perform genetic genealogy. And they led to Rex Heuermann, his wife, and his daughter. So pretty damning.
And so that case, that was a cold case if there was one. I mean, he had been, he just pleaded guilty. He'd been killing for many, many years. And these cases had gone unsolved for many, many years. So that was a case with no evidence, and they were able to crack it. I mean, Tracy, I can only hope that we're not going to wait that long, and I'm sure the Guthrie family is praying that they don't have to wait that long to get some sort of answer.
I would hope that we don't have to wait that long, but to Cece's point, we don't know how long it's ultimately going to take them. And in a missing persons case where you don't necessarily have bodies, whereas you did in Gilgo Beach, that is another issue that sort of complicates all of this as well. So you've got that passage of time, not a lot of forensic evidence, not a lot of digital evidence, and obviously no person or no victim in this case. And so I hope it gets solved a lot quicker than that, but we are dealing every minute and every second really counts.
Yeah.
We also don't know if that hair does belong to the kidnapper or not. And we won't know that until they've processed it, extracted the DNA, and been able to perform genetic genealogy to identify who that does belong to.
Yeah, I think people might not realize how many stray hairs. I mean, hair falls off the human head all the time. People walking through.
And it's not just head hair. It can be other types of hair. Facial hair, legs, arms, pubic hairs, all of those are able to be used.
And by the way, Tracy, this is a 65 or an 84-year-old woman who could not walk easily. There was blood on the front stoop, which indicates it was her blood. She was injured perhaps in some way. There might have been a struggle, in which case hair might have been, left at the scene.
actually said that, I don't know if it was on your show, but on a different show, that if there was a struggle, it was probably a mild struggle, right? Because she is 84 years
Right.
old and she does have health conditions. However, that could absolutely be useful in this case, and that we do have some of that DNA. And to Cece's point, all those black gloves that they were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know that those, necessarily belong to a perpetrator in this case. So not only do you have to identify that DNA, but then you have to investigate who that DNA belongs to rule them in and out as suspects. So we're dealing with some time here.
Yeah. Cece Moore, Tracy Walder, really appreciate it. Cece, this technology is utterly fascinating. It's unbelievable what these labs can now do. Thank you so much for explaining it in a way that I think we can all understand. Tracy already knew it, but not me. Anyway.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, ladies. Have a great weekend.
The clock didn't start ticking the day Nancy Guthrie disappeared. It started the moment something crucial failed to arrive. 11 weeks passed before a key piece of evidence finally made its way to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and by then, the investigation had already taken shape without it. In those early days, everything moved quickly. Leads were followed, tips were called in, and every detail, no matter how small, was treated as a potential breakthrough. But even with all that effort, there was a quiet sense that something wasn't adding up. Nancy's last known movements had been mapped out as best as investigators could manage, but gaps remained. Gaps that felt too significant to ignore. Family and friends held on to hope, believing that answers would come with time. What no one realized then was that time itself might be the very thing working against them. Behind the scenes, that missing piece of evidence sat elsewhere, delayed, overlooked, or caught in a process that moved far slower than the urgency of the case demanded. And as days turned into weeks, the absence of that information began shaping decisions without anyone even knowing it. When the evidence finally arrived, it didn't come with a loud announcement or immediate clarity. It came quietly, almost as if it had always been there. But the moment investigators began to examine it, everything shifted. Questions that once seemed impossible to answer suddenly felt within reach, and at the same time, more complicated than ever. If you've been following cases like this, you already know how important every second can be. Take a moment to like, subscribe, and share, because awareness keeps these stories alive and pushes them forward. The chapter ends with a realization that lingers long after the moment passes. If 11 weeks were lost, what truths were lost with them? And could they ever truly be recovered? When the delayed evidence finally reached the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it didn't come with immediate answers, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that shifts a case without warning. Investigators approached it carefully, aware that anything overlooked now could mean losing even more time. What had been missing for 11 weeks was now in front of them. No instant breakthrough, no single piece that solved everything. But as analysts began breaking it down, something started to emerge. Small details, ones that may not have stood out before, began to connect with pieces already in the case file. Timelines were revisited, and suddenly, certain gaps didn't look as random as they once did. The evidence added context where there had been confusion. It suggested movement, sequence, and possibly intent. And with that came a shift in perspective. Investigators weren't just looking at what happened anymore. They were beginning to understand how it might have happened. That difference changed everything. But alongside that progress came a difficult realization. If this information had been available earlier, would those connections have been made sooner? Would certain leads have been pursued differently? The delay wasn't just a footnote. It was becoming part of the story itself. As the analysis continued, subtle inconsistencies and earlier assumptions started to surface. Things that once felt solid now seemed uncertain. And as those foundations shifted, a new direction began to form. One that felt both promising and unsettling. If you've been following closely, this is where the story starts to turn. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share, because each new detail brings us closer to understanding what really happened. By the end of this chapter, one thing is clear. The evidence may have arrived late, but its impact is only just beginning to unfold. As the analysis deepened, the delayed evidence began to do more than just fill gaps. It started to reshape the narrative entirely. Inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, investigators revisited the case with fresh eyes, this time guided by details that hadn't been available before. What once felt like scattered fragments now began forming a sequence, one that suggested the events surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance may have unfolded in a more structured way than originally believed. The timeline, once uncertain, started tightening. Movements that didn't make sense before now aligned with the newly examined material. Certain time windows, previously written off as unclear, suddenly carried meaning. Investigators weren't just asking what happened anymore. They were beginning to ask who might have been involved, and how closely those individuals were connected to the emerging pattern. The evidence hinted at proximity, not necessarily distance, but closeness, to Nancy's last known location, to her routine, to her final moments. That realization brought a quiet intensity to the investigation, because if the clues were pointing inward rather than outward, it meant the truth might not be as far away as once thought. At the same time, earlier interviews and statements were revisited. Words that once seemed consistent now revealed subtle contradictions when placed alongside the new findings. Nothing definitive yet, but enough to raise concern. Enough to suggest that something, somewhere in the story, didn't fully line up. Midway through this unfolding development, the weight of the delay became even more apparent. 11 weeks hadn't just slowed the case. It may have allowed key details to fade, memories to shift, and opportunities to pass unnoticed. And yet, even now, the evidence was pushing the investigation forward. If you've been following this case, now's the moment to stay connected. Like, subscribe, and share, because what comes next could change everything. By the end of the chapter, a new theory begins to take shape, not fully formed but strong enough to guide the next steps. And as investigators prepare to act on it, one question hangs in the air. Were they finally closing in on the truth, or just beginning to uncover how much had been missed? The investigation no longer moved cautiously, it advanced with purpose. What began as a delayed revelation had now become the driving force behind a renewed push for answers. Inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the evidence that arrived 11 weeks late was no longer just being analyzed, it was being acted on. Leads that once seemed exhausted were reopened, and familiar names, places, and moments were brought back under scrutiny. There was a noticeable shift in energy. Interviews were revisited, not to repeat questions, but to challenge what had already been said. Subtle inconsistencies, once dismissed as human error, were now examined with greater care. Investigators paid closer attention to timing, to phrasing, to what was said and what wasn't. Because with the new evidence in mind, even the smallest detail could carry new meaning. At the same time, attention turned towards specific locations tied to Nancy Guthrie's final known movements. These places, once part of a broad search, were now treated as focal points. Patterns suggested that something significant may have happened within a more confined area than previously believed. And that realization brought urgency, because if the search had been too wide before, it meant something critical might have been overlooked in plain sight. But just as momentum built, complications emerged. Certain findings didn't align as cleanly as expected. Pieces of the puzzle fit, but not perfectly. Some details seemed to contradict others, forcing investigators to reconsider parts of their working theory. The delay, once again, cast a long shadow. Memories may have faded, conditions may have changed, and whatever traces once existed might no longer be as clear. Still, the investigation pressed forward. If you've been following this closely, now is the time to stay engaged. Like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this depend on people who refuse to look away. As the chapter draws to a close, tension reaches its peak. Investigators are closer than they've ever been, yet uncertainty still lingers. And just ahead lies a moment that could either confirm everything they've begun to believe, or force them to confront an entirely different truth. The final phase of the investigation didn't arrive with certainty. It arrived with clarity. the kind that changes everything without answering at all. Inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the delayed evidence had now been fully integrated into the case, and its impact was undeniable. What had once been a fragmented timeline was now something far more structured, pointing toward a sequence of events that felt real, tangible, and deeply unsettling. The discoveries didn't solve the case overnight, but they shifted its direction in a way that couldn't be reversed. Investigators were no longer searching blindly. They had a path, a clearer understanding of where to look, who to focus on, and what questions still needed answers. And yet, with that progress came a difficult truth. Some opportunities may have already passed, because 11 weeks isn't just time, it's distance. Distance from the moment something happened, from the clarity of fresh memory, from evidence that might have been stronger if found sooner. And as that reality settled in, it became part of the story itself. Not just what was found, but when it was found. Nancy Guthrie's name was no longer just tied to a mystery. It became a reminder of how fragile investigations can be, how easily details can slip through the cracks, and how critical timing truly is. For those who knew her, the progress brought a mix of emotions. There was movement, yes, but also the weight of knowing that answers, even when they come, don't always bring peace. Through it all, the work continued. Because even with new direction, the case wasn't closed. There were still gaps, still questions, still moments that didn't fully make sense. But the difference now was undeniable. The investigation had focus, and that focus brought it closer to the truth than ever before. If you followed this story from the beginning, you already understand why it matters. Take a moment to like, subscribe, and share, because keeping stories like this alive is what ensures they're never forgotten. The story closes not with an ending, but with a realization. Sometimes the truth isn't lost forever, it's delayed. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't just reveal what happened, it reveals how close we were all along.